Welcome back to Lore and Legends. In today's episode, we'll be diving into the realm of Marvel Comics, one of my favourite fictional universes. It's the perfect time to cover one of its more darker characters with the new movie out at the cinemas. This is the backstory, biography and history of the living vampire. In the 70s, the Comics Code Authority, a comic book censorship board, lifted a ban on the use of vampire symbols and characters in magazines for all ages. This sparked an interest in the amazing Spider-Man writers at the time, specifically Stan Lee, who wanted a new costumed vampire villain. Thus, Morbius was created by Marvel editor Roy Thomas and artist Gil Kane in 1971, and he would first appear in issue 101 of The Amazing Spider-Man. Morbius started out as an adversary of Spider-Man and later Blade, before turning to a life of anti-heroism, teaming up with the Legion of Monsters and pledging he'd only drink the blood of the guilty. He's an iconic Marvel character with his pale white skin, long black hair, and black and red leather costume. Morbius isn't actually a true vampire. His form comes from a scientific accident which turned him into a cross between a human and a blood-sucking bat species. This transformation is identified in the Marvel Universe as being a living vampire, or pseudo-vampire. He has superhuman strength, able to lift up to 1,500 pounds, supernatural speed and agility, enhanced senses that allow him to detect blood from miles away, see in multiple visions, and even use echolocation like a bat. He also has many other abilities, such as flight, a healing factor, retractable claws and fangs, mesmerization, and he doesn't age. However, the life of Morbius isn't all rainbows. The many weaknesses he suffers from is his lust for human blood, which needs to be replenished daily, else he'll lose himself within the urge. He's also extremely vulnerable against sunlight, which can weaken his form, and he suffers from hallucinations and suicidal ideations. Michael Morbius lived in Greece with his single mother after his father left them when he was only young. He was intellectually gifted and had dreams of becoming a brilliant scientist alongside his close friend Emil Nikos, but he also suffered from a rare degenerative blood disease. Michael eventually discovered that this disease was killing him. The two friends grew to become respected scientists, and they won a Nobel Prize for their work on biochemistry and blood transfusion. Michael planned for a long time on a cure for his blood disease, but through desperation, Michael and Emil decided to rush ahead and go through with the procedure. On the fateful day, he rented a ship, hoping to complete the experiment at sea where he would get no interruptions. Along with him and Emil joined his fiancée, Martine Bancroft, but against his wishes. See, Michael didn't want her to know about the experiment, knowing she would try to stop them. However, she insisted that she'd never leave Michael and went along with them. The two scientists waited till nightfall to complete the experiment, using a mixture of bat DNA and electroshock machinery. Michael was subjected to the radiation. As he screamed in agony, Emil decided to switch off the machine, not bearing to see his friend suffer. He placed Michael into a chamber to rest. When he next checked on him, Michael was transformed into a bat-like vampiric form. Chalk white skin and elongated fangs. His conscience had dissipated. His humanity had gone. His eyes felt like sandpaper. His bones gnarred. His teeth itched. There was one need on his mind. As Emil looked upon his friend, Michael pounced out of the chamber in an urge to thirst and took his first victim. What came next was sheer regret, realization, fear of what he had done. After tasting the human blood, Michael knew he was cursed to forever long for more. He thought about Martine, and his thoughts of her safety quickly turned into a horrific fetish for her blood. To snap himself out of it, he plunged into the ocean in an effort to kill himself. But he couldn't do it. Instead, he was rescued by a passing vessel that was travelling to the US. A poor mistake, as Michael killed all on board. Once his thirst and rage had passed and he regained his conscience, Michael was overwhelmed and ashamed of what he had become. Discovering his powers of flight, he left the ship and found refuge at supposedly an abandoned beach house in Long Island, New York. Here he encountered Spider-Man for the first time, who himself was trying to reverse the process that had given him 4 extra arms. Michael, now solely using his surname Morbius, hoped to take his blood and so battled Spider-Man, but their fight was interrupted by another Spidey foe, the Lizard. Morbius managed to escape and hid away in New York's back streets, taking homeless and drunks as his victims. In this short story of the Amazing Spider-Man, the duo of Lizard and Spidey soon catch up with Morbius, and taking a sample of the Doctor's blood, the pair manage to cure themselves of their own transformations, whereas Morbius escapes. Unaware of the character's popularity, the Amazing Spider-Man comics moved on, and Morbius wouldn't return until the comic book series Marvel Team-Up. Morbius' fiancée, Martine, went to the Fantastic Four to ask for help. Human Torch seemed to remember Spider-Man talking to him about his battle with Morbius, and he teamed up with the Wallcrawler to find him. Morbius would then appear in the next issue of Marvel Team-Up, almost getting saved by the X-Men's Charles Xavier before he broke out of his restraints and escapes. After the Marvel Team-Up series, Morbius wouldn't get many runs in other Marvel comics until the horror comics came along, the black and white Vampire Tales and Adventure into Fear. However, these stories weren't very popular and mostly felt like filler in Morbius' history. This is where he first encounters Blade, the vampire hunter. Blade disengages his attack when he realises that Morbius isn't a true vampire. Martine would use his Nobel Prize money to buy a manor in which they would try to create a cure, but again to no luck. For the next few years, Morbius would kind of fade into the background, only appearing as a side character or a guest, usually teaming up with other characters with transformations themselves, willing to cure each other, like with Spidey foe Manwolf, or joining the short-lived Legion of Monsters in Marvel Premiere Comics. However, Morbius' unrelenting lust for blood would continue to sabotage any luck he would have in finding a cure. For the remainder of the 20th century, Morbius mostly appeared as a guest character. He had a brief run-in with Doctor Strange, he sided with black-suited Spider-Man, he even had his own page in the adult comic Marvel Swimsuit Special. But Morbius would get the revival he needed when he joined the supernatural team, the Midnight Suns, in the pages of Ghost Rider, a team built to defend Earth against occult forces and Queen of all demons, Lilith. This prompted Morbius to get his first comic book series, dedicated solely to himself in the mid-90s, Morbius the Living Vampire. In this run that lasted for a whopping 32 issues, Morbius is still at large in New York City, drinking the blood of the innocent. Martine Bancroft makes her return. Martine has a contact, a Dr. Langford, who says he can cure Morbius once and for all. But upon giving him the cure, Morbius has a severe reaction to it and breaks out of the lab. Meanwhile, Martine discovers that Dr. Langford was working for a third party. Martine pulls a gun out at Langford, and in a quick struggle, Martine is shot in the chest. When Morbius arrives back to the lab, he sees the dying Martine on the floor. He wastes no time in remorse. He lashes out and proceeds to kill Dr. Langford. Ghost Rider returns and sees the chaos which Morbius has wrought. Ghost Rider uses his penance stare on Morbius, showing him the darkest side to his soul. This procedure would burn any normal man, but for Morbius, he already feels his pain every time that he feeds. Ghost Rider discovers that this is not any guilty criminal, but rather a tormented soul. Morbius breaks a deal with Ghost Rider, in that from this point forth, he shall only drink the blood of the corrupt and guilty. The next issues show Morbius trying to deal with his mutated thirst for blood. He tries to get a cure from Spider-Man's blood, but when asking the webhead for a sample, Spidey tells him he can't. Morbius calls him a hypocrite, saying Spider-Man's ethics are based only on momentary whims. and Morbius's plea for help gets ignored due to what it may cost Spider-Man personally. "You believe yourself the good Samaritan, and I the sad, crazed beast, but in truth, we are both monsters." One of my favourite lines in Morbius's history. Spidey, just as much as the reader, pities Morbius. He truly wants to change, but Parker can't sabotage his life to save him, saying that fate has made them both victims. During their battle, Morbius discovers another ability caused through his mutation. He hypnotizes Spider-Man into giving him the blood sample and telling him to swing away and forget about this night. He tests the new formula, but like previous attempts, the cure is only short-lived. Having half the day like normal, where he starts work as a hematologist, and then at night, or if he's stressed or anxious, he's back to feasting on back alley thugs and hired mercenaries. Morbius would face a small rogues gallery of foes, like the Basilisk, a reptilian monster who had lost the humanity that Morbius is so desperate to seek; Nightmare, the ruler of the realm of nightmares, who gained pleasure feasting on Morbius's dreams of being with Martine; and when CIA agent Stroud returns to hunt down Morbius, he hires an assassin called Vic Slaughter, that when bitten by Morbius and buried alive, he comes back as a turned vampire. The 90s was definitely the boom for the Morbius character. Alongside his own series, he appeared in multiple storylines across other comics, teaming up with Johnny Blaze, Hannibal King and Blade in Night Stalkers, forming a friendship with the Werewolf by Night Jack Russell, an ally Morbius has been keen to develop a cure for over the years, and he was even successful in using a magical book called The Darkhold to revive Martine from the grave. However, she became back as a tormented vampire, not like the Martine that Morbius had loved. By the end of his 90s solo series, Morbius continued to work at the St. Jude's Hospital in his human guise, and he grew apart from the undead Martine. After his comic series and the abandonment of the Midnight Suns during the 90s, the Morbius character would see another age of very few appearances, becoming a background character or having a short anthology story at the most. In the 2000s, we wouldn't see much of Morbius even during the Civil War. We only see a glimpse of him. He signed up to the Superhuman Registration Act and partnered with S.H.I.E.L.D. for a time in order to track down Blade and get him also to sign over. This is all we'd see of him until his one-shot comic novel Legion of Monsters Morbius the Living Vampire, which released in 2007. This is a short story that saw Morbius attempt to isolate himself and hold back the lust for blood until a fateful group of teenagers stumble upon him and aren't too fortunate. This comic introduces his thirst as a voice in his head that pushes him to feast whenever he needs it. The next few years would see a few more appearances of Morbius after he joined a new legion of monsters consisting of Man-Thing, Werewolf, Amphibian, the Living Mummy and more, and they helped him building Monster Metropolis, a home for monsters buried deep beneath New York City. He took part in the resurrection of the Punisher as Frankencastle, who joined the team for a short time. In the 2010s, Morbius made his reappearance in the Amazing Spider-Man comics, in which his old ex-fiancée Martine comes back and tracks down Morbius for good, and tries to sway him back to her with her psychological powers. However, in a trick, Morbius pushes her into a wooden stake, killing her and turning her into ash. Morbius would later appear in the Spider Island storyline, where he massacres multiple scientists at Peter Parker's workplace Horizon Labs in a blind thirst. Morbius is apprehended and sent to the Raft high security prison. Morbius's imprisonment would be short-lived, as in Amazing Spider-Man issue 699.1, Dr. Octopus would release him and several other villains in a planned breakout. This would spark the making of Morbius's second limited run series, Morbius the Living Vampire Volume 2. In this limited series, Morbius hides away in the crime-ridden town of Brownsville, away from superheroes and detective agencies. He becomes the town's fabled vigilante for a time, and teams up with Spider-Man once again to capture the villain Rose, who had broken into Horizon Labs. By the end of the series, Morbius was back to hiding away in the shadows, trying any attempt to live a normal life. It would take Morbius another 7 years to get a third solo series, with the time between seeing some increasingly minor cameo appearances in Deadpool and Domino Comics. In the 2020 5-issue limited series Morbius, we pick up with the now Brownsville vigilante when he is attacked by new vampire hunter Elizabeth Nikos. Yes, the sister to Emil Nikos, Morbius' old friend and first victim. She's been training for years to track down and kill Morbius, all in name of revenge, and she almost achieves it, until their duel is intervened by Spider-Man. She comes to her senses and leaves Morbius, saying she needs to forget her crave for revenge and find her true self. Morbius was lucky enough to gain a solo comic just 1 year later in 2021, Morbius Bond of Blood. This introduced another Nikos, Emil's son Christos. The boy, ironically, is also suffering from a degenerative disease, and we find out that Morbius had been monitoring his health ever since Emil's death. This issue marked Christos' final hours before his demise, where Morbius gets a quick chance to confess to Christos what he did to his father, and before the boy takes his last breath, he tells Uncle Morbius that he forgives him. The final page sees Morbius after the boy's funeral with Emil and Michael in the sky above, a symbolic and powerful ending to this comic and to this character. And that brings you up to date on the living vampire. Morbius is more than you may think, a once good doctor now tormented by a crazed, unendurable, crawling agony of bloodthirst, only for his hunger to be followed by guilt and anguish, his soul crying out in torment. He started out as a fairly classical, universal monster villain, but his 90s series, which I'd say is his best collection of stories to date, added back in that human side to give him more development and help the reader side with him more. Morbius is definitely more than a villain. He wants to help people, but he knows that he cannot suppress those vampire instincts inside him. This makes him his own worst enemy, and that's what makes him a fascinating character. Still, once you get out of the 90s era, the 2000s start to see the repetition of this character. He's caught in this endless cycle of trying to find a cure, it going wrong, people getting hurt, and Morbius is then filled with regret, having to move someplace else and start again on the cure. Personally, I don't think we'll see much of Morbius after the film has released. It's already garnered plenty of negative reception, and there's not really much to do with this character. The 90s Morbius will always be that high point, and with that, this has been Lore and Legends. I really hope you enjoyed this video. It took a long time to make. There was like nearly 200 comics to read through and look at and research for this character, but I'll see you in the next video where the lust for blood is even stronger. I'll see you then, and adios, take care.